I wasn't supposed to be on that road that night. The rain came down in silver sheets, blurring everything beyond the glow of my headlights. The highway stretched endlessly, empty and quiet, and the world felt like it had forgotten me. But life has a strange way of leading us to the places we need to be, even when we don't understand why. Up ahead, I saw a flicker of red and blue through the rain. At first I thought it was just a broken sign or a reflection. Then I saw him, a young police officer lying by a fallen motorcycle, his uniform soaked and torn. For a second I froze. Then instinct took over. I pulled over, ran through the downpour and knelt beside him. He was breathing but weakly. Blood seeped through his sleeve. My heart pounded as I pressed my jacket against the wound, my fingers trembling. "Hey, stay with me," I said, though I didn't even know his name. His eyes opened slowly, dazed but calm. "Liam," he whispered. "My name's Liam." And somehow, even in pain, he managed a small, tired smile, like he was trying to comfort me instead of himself. The sirens were still distant. I held on, pressing harder against the wound, trying to keep him talking. He told me he'd been chasing a reckless driver when his bike slipped on the wet road. I told him help was on the way, though I was terrified he wouldn't make it. When the ambulance arrived, I followed them to the hospital. I could have gone home, but something in me refused. I told myself it was concern, but it felt like more than that. A quiet pull I couldn't explain. Hours passed in the waiting room. My clothes were still damp, coffee cold in my hands. Nurses moved in and out of the hallway, and every time a door opened, I looked up, hoping for news. Grace, my wife, hadn't called. I knew she wouldn't. We hadn't really spoken beyond routine check-ins in months. She was probably working late again, chasing deadlines and dreams we no longer shared. When the nurse finally told me Liam was awake, I hesitated before walking in. The room was dim, the air heavy with antiseptic and rain that clung to my clothes. He looked up when I entered, his arm bandaged, his skin pale but his smile still there. "You didn't have to wait," he said quietly. "You were alone," I answered. "Someone should have," he gave a faint laugh. "Not the first time I've been alone." I sat down beside him, unsure why I felt like I belonged there. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the way his words echoed something inside me. We talked softly at first, about his work, the long nights, the danger, and the silence that followed him home. Then he asked about me. I told him I was married, that my wife and I had grown distant, living side by side but miles apart. He nodded like he understood. "Guess we both wear uniforms of a kind," he said. "Mine's stitched with a badge, yours, maybe with expectations." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was true. I hadn't felt seen like that in years. The clock ticked. Machines hummed quietly. I should have left long ago, but I didn't want to. It was strange. Sitting there with a stranger felt easier than sitting in my own living room. I felt present, connected, alive in a way I hadn't in a long time. When he finally closed his eyes to rest, I stood there for a moment, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. I whispered, "You're going to be okay," even though he couldn't hear me anymore. Then I walked out into the cold, wet night. The rain had softened to a drizzle. The world felt quieter, lighter somehow. I sat in my car for a while, staring at my phone. No missed calls, no messages, just silence. And then, just as I started the engine, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I opened the message. "Thank you for saving my life tonight." "Liam," I stared at the screen for a long time. My fingers hovered before I typed back. "Glad you're okay. Get some rest." I hesitated, then pressed send. That simple exchange, 2 short lines, felt warmer than any conversation I'd had at home in months. As I drove away, dawn began to break behind the clouds. The rain stopped, the sky lightened, and the road shimmered like glass. I told myself it was just a good deed, that I stayed because it was the right thing to do. But as the city woke around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had begun that night. Not love, not yet. Just a quiet spark, small enough to ignore, but bright enough to change everything. It had been 3 weeks since that night. I told myself I'd only check in once, just to see how he was healing. But when Liam's message came, "Doctor says I can walk again, coffee to celebrate," I didn't even hesitate before saying yes. He opened the door wearing a sling, his arm still in recovery, but his smile was whole. The small apartment smelled like old books and brewed coffee. A guitar leaned against the wall, a few medals on a shelf. Quiet traces of who he was beyond the uniform. We talked for hours that day. At first, it was about simple things, how he joined the force, how I ended up writing news stories instead of living them. But somewhere between the jokes and the silences, something shifted. It wasn't romantic, not yet, just honest. Two lonely men speaking freely for the first time in too long. He told me he'd grown up in a small town where people saw only what they wanted to, where kindness was mistaken for weakness. I told him about Grace, how our marriage had turned into something polite and careful, more like partnership than love. We'd built a life that looked perfect from the outside, but inside it was quiet in all the wrong ways. When I left that afternoon, he handed me a small keychain shaped like a police badge. "To remind you of courage," he said. I smiled, but something in my chest tightened. I slipped it into my pocket like it meant nothing, but it did. Days turned into weeks, and texts turned into long calls that lasted past midnight. Grace would fall asleep beside me, her phone glowing with unread emails, and I'd whisper to Liam about stories I never told anyone, about the parts of me that didn't fit the life I had built. He listened, really listened, and in return I listened to him. His fears, his dreams, his laughter that came too easily and died too fast. It wasn't love, I kept telling myself. It was gratitude, friendship, healing. But every time I heard his voice, the emptiness inside me shifted, as if filling itself back in pieces. One night, I told him I sometimes felt invisible at home. He didn't interrupt, didn't tell me to be grateful for what I had. He just said, "Sometimes we choose silence because it's safer than the truth." That line stuck with me for days. At home, Grace noticed the distance. She started leaving small notes on the fridge again. "Dinner at 8. Don't stay up too late." I should have been touched, but guilt replaced warmth. Every moment with her felt like pretending. Every word felt rehearsed. Then one evening, I caught myself smiling at my phone while reading one of Liam's messages. Grace saw it. She didn't ask who it was, but her eyes said enough. That silent question lingered between us through dinner, through the dishes, through the quiet hum of our separate screens. Later that night, as she slept, I stood by the window staring at the city lights. My reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, someone trapped between two lives. One real, one right, and I wasn't sure which was which anymore. Liam texted again. "Still awake?" I typed back, "Yeah, can't sleep." Seconds later came his reply, "You ever think about that night? The road, the rain, what it started?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I did. I thought about it every day. About the way he looked at me that night. Not as a stranger, but as someone who mattered. The next morning I tried to refocus. I wrote, I worked, I smiled when I needed to. But the truth followed me like a quiet shadow. Emotional lines had already been crossed, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. I began to realize that infidelity doesn't always start with a kiss. Sometimes it begins with someone finally asking how you've really been, and meaning it. Grace left early that evening for another business trip. Before she walked out the door, she paused, looking at me for a moment longer than usual. "Don't stay up too late," she said softly. I nodded, knowing the distance between us wasn't measured in hours anymore. Later that night, Liam called. The sound of his voice through the static felt like warmth after a long winter. We didn't talk about love. We didn't have to. It was already there, quiet and unspoken, sitting between us like the calm before a storm. After we hung up, I stared at the small badge keychain he'd given me. The metal caught the light, simple, honest, real. I held it in my hand, feeling both grateful and guilty. I knew I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something that could undo the life I'd built. But as I looked out into the city that night, all I could think about was the sound of his voice when he said my name. Sometimes, What feels wrong can feel like the only thing that makes sense. I met Liam one last time on a gray afternoon by the lake. The wind was cold, restless, like it already knew what we were about to say. I watched him from a distance for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes on the water. He looked stronger now, healed on the outside, but something in his posture told me he wasn't. Maybe neither of us were. When I walked up beside him, we didn't speak at first. Just stood there, the silence heavy but not cruel. Then he said softly, "I thought about not asking you to come." "I thought about not saying yes," I replied. He smiled faintly, eyes still fixed on the lake. "Didn't work though, did it?" I shook my head. For a while, we talked like we always did, carefully, like two people afraid to break something fragile. He told me he'd been offered a transfer to another precinct. I told him I'd been trying to fix things at home. He nodded, quiet. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "You changed something in me. Ethan, you made me believe people could still care without wanting something in return. I wanted to tell him he'd done the same for me, but the words stayed in my throat. The truth was, he'd made me feel alive again, and that terrified me." He turned to face me then, eyes full of everything we'd both been avoiding. "Tell me honestly," he said. "If things were different, would you have chosen me?" I didn't look away. "If things were different," I said, "I wouldn't need to choose." The wind carried my words away before I could take them back. We both knew what they meant, that timing, not love, had betrayed us. That what we had wasn't a mistake, but it couldn't become more. He looked down, nodded once, then took something from his pocket. The same small police badge keychain he'd given me weeks ago. "Keep it," I said. He smiled faintly. "No, you keep it. Maybe one day it'll remind you that you were brave enough to care." There was nothing left to say. We stood there until the light began to fade, the lake catching the last reflection of the sun. When I finally turned to leave, he said quietly, "Take care, Ethan." I didn't look back. I couldn't. On the drive home, the roads blurred again beneath the rain, full circle just like the night we met. Only this time the silence inside me wasn't empty. It was full of the things I wished I could have said. Grace was waiting when I got home. No anger, no suspicion, just a look that told me she already knew something had changed. We sat in the kitchen, no words for a long time. Finally, she asked, "Are you happy?" It wasn't a question about us. It was about me, the person I'd become, the parts of me she'd stopped recognizing. I told her the truth. "No, but I want to be," she nodded, her eyes glistening. "Then let's start there. That night we didn't fix everything. We didn't promise forever, but for the first time in a long time we spoke honestly. About the distance, the silence, the way we'd both let life replace love. It wasn't easy, but it was real." In the weeks that followed, I deleted Liam's number, but never his memory. Some nights, when the house was quiet, I'd still think about the lake, the sound of the wind, the way he smiled when he said goodbye. It didn't hurt. It reminded me. Months later, I came across a news story while writing an article, an off-duty officer organizing a local rescue initiative. The name caught my eye, Officer Liam Hayes. There was a photo, him smiling with a group of volunteers, a bandage peeking from under his sleeve. He looked lighter, freer somehow. I smiled too. Sometimes love doesn't end with forever. Sometimes it ends with gratitude, for being seen, for being saved, for learning how to feel again. I closed my laptop and stepped outside. The evening air was cool, the sky fading into gold. Grace was watering the small plants by our porch, her hair catching the light. She looked up and smiled at me, not the kind of smile that fixes everything, but the kind that tries. And that was enough. As the sun slipped below the horizon, I reached into my pocket and felt the keychain. Still there, still shining faintly. Maybe it wasn't just a symbol of courage. Maybe it was a reminder that even broken hearts can beat honestly again. I took a deep breath, watching the last light fade over the city. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel torn. I just felt human, flawed, forgiven, and finally free.